Apparently, sitting on your own dock is a crime now, at least according to my HOA president, who fined me $200 a day for denying community lake access on my private property. She filmed me fixing a kayak, called it a civil rights violation, and tried to hold a neighborhood vote right there on my dock. Spoiler, she brought a clipboard and zero understanding of property law. Next thing I know, I'm being accused of discrimination, obstruction, and unneighborly shoreline behavior. Ever been gaslit with a fake survey while holding a wrench? Drop your wildest HOA stories in the comments. I need emotional support and possibly a lawyer with a taser. It was a peaceful Sunday morning in early September when everything started. I was out on my dock fixing an old kayak, enjoying the quiet before the weekend crowd showed up at the public beach about half a mile down the shore. The morning sun was hitting the water just right, creating those perfect ripples that made me grateful I'd bought this place 2 years ago. I'd spent every penny of my savings to get this house with lake access, and as a boat restorer, having my own dock was like a dream come true. The property line was crystal clear on my deed, running right down to the water's edge, with the dock sitting squarely on my land. That's when I heard voices approaching from behind. I turned around to see Deborah Monroe marching across my yard like she owned the place, followed by about 5 or 6 neighbors I recognized from the monthly HOA meetings. Deborah was in her late 30s, always looking frazzled with her messy hair and wrinkled clothes, like she'd just rolled out of bed angry at the world. She'd been HOA president for 4 years running, and from what I'd heard, she ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist. The woman had a reputation for nitpicking everything from lawn height to mailbox colors. "Calvin Brooks," she announced, pointing her finger at me like I was some kind of criminal. "We need to discuss your dock situation." Her voice had that sharp, condescending tone that immediately put me on edge. The neighbors behind her looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot, but none of them spoke up. "This lakefront access belongs to the community," Deborah continued, pulling out her phone and starting to record. "You can't just monopolize a shared resource because you happen to live next to it." I set down my tools and stood up slowly, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "Deborah, this dock is on my private property. It's clearly marked in my deed and the property survey. The community beach access is down the shore where it's always been." I gestured toward the public area, which was visible in the distance, but Deborah wasn't having any of it. She stepped right onto my dock, still filming, and declared that she was conducting an investigation into discriminatory practices. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was being punked, except this woman was dead serious. "I'm live streaming this so the community can see what kind of neighbor you really are," Deborah announced, holding her phone up higher. "Calvin Brooks, everyone. The man who thinks he can deny families access to our beautiful lake." She was really playing it up for the camera, using that fake, sweet voice people use when they're trying to seem reasonable while being completely unreasonable. Then she did something that blew my mind. She pulled out a piece of paper and started creating a fake survey right there on the spot. "Who here agrees that this dock should be shared with the community?" she asked the uncomfortable neighbors, basically pressuring them to sign something they probably didn't even understand. I knew I had to document this insanity, so I pulled out my own phone and started taking pictures. "Deborah, you're standing on my private property right now," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm asking you politely to leave." But instead of leaving, she plopped down on one of the dock posts and crossed her arms. "I'm not going anywhere until we resolve this community issue," she declared. That's when I realized this woman was completely unhinged. I walked back to my house, grabbed a small flag I used for boat repairs, and planted it right at the edge of the dock, with "public property" written on it in black marker. The whole confrontation lasted about 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Joanne Clark, my neighbor from 3 houses down, stood at the edge of my yard watching the whole thing with a worried expression. I'd seen her at HOA meetings before, but she never spoke up about anything. She always seemed nervous around Deborah, and now I was starting to understand why. As Deborah finally got up from the dock, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "Tomorrow morning, you'll see exactly what kind of power this HOA has, Calvin. You picked the wrong fight." The way she said it sent a chill down my spine, but I wasn't about to back down from someone trying to steal my property. The next morning, I found the letter. $200 per day fine for obstruction of community rights and violation of neighborhood harmony policies. I read it 3 times before the absurdity really sank in. According to Deborah's letter, I was somehow breaking HOA rules by using my own dock, and the fine would continue until I restored community access. The letter was typed on official-looking HOA letterhead and signed with Deborah's dramatic flourish of a signature. It felt like getting punched in the gut, not because of the money, but because of the sheer audacity of it all. But Deborah wasn't done. Within an hour of me finding that letter, my phone started buzzing with notifications. She'd created a fake email address that looked like it came from something called the Pine Lake Property Assessment Office and sent me a threatening message about potential land seizure if I didn't comply with community standards. The email was full of legal-sounding language that was probably meant to scare me into submission. Then she posted that video from yesterday on the neighborhood social media page with the caption, "Witness discriminatory behavior, Calvin Brooks denies families access to our lake." The comment section was already filling up with people who only saw her side of the story. That night, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the fine notice like it might spontaneously combust. My once peaceful kitchen, where I used to enjoy my morning coffee in tranquility, was now cluttered with warning letters and threatening documents. Every time the phone rang, my heart would skip a beat. Was it the bank? The insurance company? I'd never felt so afraid in my own home before. It wasn't because Deborah was lurking outside. It was because she was making me doubt my own right to exist in my own space. The woman was turning my sanctuary into a prison of anxiety and self-doubt. Around 10 that evening, I heard a soft knock at my door. When I opened it, Joanne Clark was standing there with a manila folder in her hands, looking nervous but determined. "Calvin, I brought you something," she whispered, glancing around like she was afraid of being watched. She handed me the folder, which contained old HOA meeting minutes and bylaws from 5 years ago. "Look at page 12, she said. "Deborah's been making up rules that don't exist in our actual charter. She's done this before to other people." As I flipped through the documents, I could see discrepancies between what Deborah claimed the HOA could do and what the actual bylaws stated. This was evidence that her entire campaign against me was built on fabricated authority. 3 days later, Deborah called an emergency HOA meeting. The subject line of her email to all residents was, "Addressing the Calvin Brooks situation. Community action required." I knew I had to be there to defend myself, so I gathered up copies of my property deed, the original land survey, and now Joanne's evidence of HOA rule fabrication. Walking into that meeting felt like entering a courtroom where I was already guilty in the judge's eyes. The community center was packed with more people than I'd ever seen at an HOA meeting, and Deborah had clearly been working overtime to drum up support. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Deborah began, standing at the front of the room like she was addressing Congress. "We're here tonight because one of our neighbors has decided that community values don't apply to him." She'd prepared a whole presentation, complete with printed photos of my dock and a fake survey that she claimed showed 90% of residents wanted to share lake access. The woman had clearly put more effort into this vendetta than most people put into their actual jobs. Every time I tried to speak up, she'd cut me off or talk over me, controlling the narrative like a master manipulator. When I finally got a chance to present my side, I pulled out the official property documents and explained calmly that the dock was entirely on my private land. "The community beach access has always been down the shore," I said, pointing to the area that was clearly marked as public space. "This dock was built by the previous owner on private property, and it's been private property for the last 15 years. But Deborah had an answer ready for everything. She claimed the previous owner had always allowed community access, and that I was breaking with neighborhood tradition. None of what she said was true, but she said it with such conviction that I could see some people nodding along. The most frustrating part was watching how she avoided every direct question about HOA authority. When I asked to see the specific rule that gave the HOA control over private property, she deflected with talk about community spirit and neighborhood values. When I pointed out that HOA rules can't override property deeds, she accused me of being hostile to community input. It was like arguing with someone who lived in a completely different reality. I started recording the whole meeting on my phone, partly for evidence and partly because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The meeting ended with Deborah basically declaring war. "Calvin Brooks has made it clear that he values his own selfish interests over the good of this community," she announced dramatically. "If he won't do the right thing voluntarily, then this HOA will explore every legal avenue available to protect our residents' rights." The room erupted in murmurs, and I could feel the eyes of my neighbors on me like I was some kind of villain. As I packed up my documents, Joanne Clark approached me quietly. "She tried to fine me $50 last year because my flower garden didn't have the right permit," she whispered. "Be careful, Calvin. She doesn't give up easily." That night, after the HOA meeting, I started researching HOA legal limits. What I found was reassuring. Technically, they couldn't seize private property or override my deed, but that comfort didn't last long. The next morning, I found a manila envelope on my porch. No return address, just my name, printed in block letters. Inside was a crudely drawn map of my house, my dock, my windows, even the new camera I'd just installed. Every location was labeled in red Sharpie with words like target, observe, and flagged. There was no threat written, but it felt like a threat in its purest form. I called Joanne. She arrived within 10 minutes and went pale as soon as she saw it. "She's trying to mess with your head," she whispered. "Make you paranoid. Or make you snap." I set the map down beside my property deed, then I looked straight into the nearest security camera and said quietly, "If this is a game, I've figured out the rules." The week from hell began on Monday morning, but not with another letter or HOA fine. This time, it started with silence. A silence that felt too deliberate. I walked out to the dock, coffee in one hand, and scanned the yard. No Deborah, no clipboard, no camera, no neighbors peeking through blinds, just birdsong, calm water, and my own rising sense of dread. I should have been relieved. I wasn't. 10 minutes later, I got a text from an unknown number. It read, "Documented day 1. Let's see how long your privacy holds." Attached, a photo of me on the dock, taken just seconds ago, from an angle my own cameras couldn't see. That's when I realized Deborah wasn't trying to win a legal fight anymore. She was trying to win a psychological war of attrition. Joanne confirmed it later that afternoon. "She's changed tactics," she said flatly. "It's no longer about the dock. She wants to rattle you until you give her something she can weaponize." So I gave her what she didn't expect. Calm. I spent the rest of that day expanding my security system, adding motion sensors, more high-angle cams, even a trail camera in the woods behind my house. I printed off every email, every text, and backed up everything to a cloud server. She wanted me paranoid. Instead, I got methodical. By Wednesday, she'd escalated to creating a group chat called the Calvin Situation Updates that included apparently every single homeowner in Pine Lake. I only found out about it when Joanne Clark showed me some of the messages on her phone. Deborah was sending daily reports about my violations, complete with time-stamped photos and dramatic commentary about my refusal to cooperate with community standards. She was painting me as some kind of neighborhood villain who was holding the entire community hostage with my selfishness. The woman had turned harassment into an art form. Thursday brought a new level of crazy. Deborah filed a complaint with the city claiming my dock was structurally unsafe and a liability to the community. The complaint was full of lies about loose boards and unstable foundations, none of which were true. My dock was solid as a rock. I'd personally inspected every board when I bought the house. But her complaint meant I'd probably have to deal with city inspectors and prove that my own property was safe. She was weaponizing every system she could think of to make my life miserable. The social isolation was getting to me, too. When I walked around the lake that evening, trying to clear my head, I noticed how different the neighborhood felt. Parents would pull their children closer when they saw me coming. Steve Martinez, who used to wave from his yard, now avoided eye contact entirely. One father I'd never spoken to before actually told his kids they couldn't play near my house anymore because that man causes trouble. Looking back at my own home from across the lake, it felt foreign and unwelcoming, like I was a stranger being forced out of my own life. That's when I decided to fight back smart. First, I installed security cameras around the dock area, 2 high-definition cameras that could live stream everything 24/7. Then, I made a big sign that read, "No HO, private property," and mounted it right at the entrance to the dock where nobody could miss it. Finally, I printed out my property deed and survey map, enlarged them to poster size, and framed them by the door, leading to my dock. If Deborah wanted to play games with documentation, I'd give her all the documentation she could handle. The cameras were a game changer. Within hours of installing them, I had clear footage of Deborah placing a fake sign over mine that read, "Community Dock under review." When I went out to remove her illegal sign, she appeared out of nowhere with her phone, filming me and screaming about property destruction. "You're all witnessing this," she yelled into her camera. "Calvin Brooks is destroying community property right in front of us." The irony was incredible. She was accusing me of destroying property while literally trespassing on my land. That confrontation was the first time I really lost my cool. "Get off my property, Deborah," I shouted, louder than I'd intended. "You're trespassing, you're harassing me, and you're lying to the entire neighborhood." She kept filming, probably hoping I'd do something that would make me look like the aggressor. The whole thing felt like a trap, like she was trying to provoke me into giving her ammunition to use against me. But I managed to control myself, remove her sign, and walk back to my house while she continued her dramatic performance for the camera. Late that night, I took another walk around the lake, needing to escape the suffocating feeling of being watched in my own home. From the far shore, I could see my house in the distance, my dock barely visible in the moonlight. It struck me how surreal this whole situation had become. I was standing on public land, looking at my private property, and feeling like an exile from my own life. Deborah hadn't just invaded my physical space, she'd invaded my sense of belonging in my own neighborhood. The house I'd worked so hard to buy now felt like a battlefield where I was constantly under siege. By Friday, I was documenting everything, every trespassing incident, every false claim, every threatening message. I had hours of video footage, dozens of photos, and a detailed log of Deborah's harassment campaign. That evening, as I sat on my dock watching the sunset, Deborah appeared one more time. "Next week, I'm cutting off your access completely," she announced with a satisfied smirk. "Let's see how much you love that private property when you can't even get to it." The threat sent a chill through me, but I was done being intimidated. Whatever she had planned, I'd be ready for it. Monday morning, I woke up to the sound of power tools in my yard. I looked out my bedroom window and couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was a crew installing a metal fence that completely blocked my access to the dock from my own house. The fence ran right across what should have been my clear path to the water, with a big sign that read, "Danger, unsafe dock by order of OA order." Deborah was standing there supervising like some kind of construction foreman, directing the workers with an expression of pure satisfaction on her face. I threw on clothes and rushed outside, my heart pounding with anger and disbelief. "What the hell is this, Deborah?" I demanded. "You can't just put a fence on my property." But she was ready with her answer. "This fence is on HOA common area," she lied smoothly. "We're protecting the community from a dangerous structure until proper safety inspections can be completed." The workers looked uncomfortable, probably realizing they were in the middle of some kind of property dispute, but they kept working because Deborah was the one paying them. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of everything: the fence, the workers, Deborah's smug face, the exact location of the installation. Then I ran inside and grabbed my property survey maps to prove that the fence was entirely on my land. But by the time I got back outside, Deborah had her own phone out and was live streaming the whole thing. "Calvin Brooks is having another meltdown," she announced to her audience. "As you can see, he's extremely aggressive when the community tries to protect itself from his unsafe property." The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. I couldn't get to my own dock without climbing over a fence that someone had illegally installed on my property. My homeowner's insurance company called me that afternoon because they'd received Deborah's complaint about structural hazards. I had to schedule an emergency inspection to prove that my dock was safe, just to keep my insurance from being canceled. The woman was systematically attacking every aspect of my property ownership, trying to make it too expensive and difficult for me to fight back. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I printed out huge posters with photos of the illegal fence and mounted them in my yard with the caption, "Deborah's illegal fence, day 1. I set up a continuous live stream of the fence on my social media, documenting the violation in real time, and I started my own poster campaign, putting up signs around the neighborhood that showed the exact property lines and proved the fence was on private land. If Deborah wanted to play dirty, I'd play smart. The breaking point came 3 days later when I tried to remove the fence myself. I'd had enough of being blocked from my own property, so I brought out wire cutters and started working on the lock. That's when Deborah appeared, like she'd been waiting for this moment. She started filming immediately, screaming into her phone about property destruction and violent behavior. "He's cutting our safety fence," she yelled. "He's destroying community property right in front of everyone." I completely lost it. All the frustration and anger from the past weeks came pouring out. "This is my property, Deborah. You can't just steal people's land because you feel like it." I was shouting now, waving the wire cutters in the air, probably looking exactly as crazy as she wanted me to look on camera. "You're a liar and a bully, and everyone in this neighborhood knows it." It felt good to finally say what I really thought, but I knew I'd just given her exactly the footage she wanted. She didn't waste any time using it either. Within minutes, she was calling the police, claiming I'd threatened her and was destroying community property. She edited the video to make it look like I was the aggressor, cutting out all the parts where she was trespassing and lying. By the time she posted it online, I looked like a dangerous neighbor having a violent meltdown over a simple community safety measure. The narrative was completely flipped, and I was the villain in my own story. That night, as I lay in bed listening for sirens, I realized that Deborah had been planning this whole escalation from the beginning. The fence wasn't just about blocking my dock access, it was about forcing me into a reaction that she could use against me. She'd set a trap, and I'd walked right into it. But as angry as I was at myself for losing control, I was even more determined to prove that she was the real problem. Tomorrow, I'd find out just how deep her web of lies really went. The police sirens woke up half the neighborhood. I watched from my window as Deputy Alan Morse pulled into my driveway, his patrol car's lights painting everything in red and blue. My stomach dropped as I realized that Deborah had actually gone through with calling the cops. I'd never been in trouble with the law in my life, and here I was, about to be questioned like some kind of criminal because I'd tried to access my own property. When I opened the front door, Deputy Morse looked tired and slightly annoyed, like this was the last call he wanted to be on. He was a stocky guy in his mid-40s with graying hair and the patient expression of someone who'd seen every kind of neighbor dispute imaginable. "Mr. Brooks," he said, consulting his notepad, "I got a call about property destruction and threatening behavior. Mind if we talk about what happened here today?" His tone was professional, but not hostile, which gave me hope that maybe he'd actually listen to my side of the story. Before I could answer, Deborah came rushing over from wherever she'd been hiding, clutching her phone like it was evidence in a murder trial. She'd clearly been crying, or at least working hard to look like she'd been crying, with smeared makeup and red eyes that made her seem like a victim. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she sobbed dramatically. "This man has been terrorizing our community for weeks. Today he threatened me with a weapon and destroyed our safety fence." She held up her phone with the edited video, ready to show her version of events. I watched in amazement as Deborah delivered an Oscar-worthy performance. She claimed to be an elderly woman just trying to protect her community, who was being intimidated and threatened by an aggressive neighbor. She showed the deputy her edited video, which made me look like a maniac attacking innocent community property. Every word out of her mouth was either a lie or a twisted version of the truth, but she said it all with such conviction that I could see Deputy Morris taking notes and nodding along. When it was finally my turn to speak, I felt like I was already behind in a game I didn't know how to play. "Deputy, this woman has been harassing me for weeks," I started, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. "She's fined me for using my own property. She's had a fence installed on my private land, and she's been running a campaign to turn the neighborhood against me." But as I talked, I realized how crazy my story sounded without all the evidence right at hand. I had photos and videos, but they were on my phone and computer, not organized and ready to present like Deborah's edited masterpiece. That's when something unexpected happened. Joanne Clark came walking across the yard, looking nervous but determined. "Excuse me, officer," she said quietly, "but I think you should know that this isn't the first time Deborah has harassed a neighbor like this." Deputy Morse looked up from his notepad with renewed interest as Joanne continued. "She tried to fine me $50 last year because I planted flowers without getting HOA permission first. She's been bullying people in this neighborhood for years, and now she's going after Calvin because he won't let her steal his dock." As Joanne spoke, she pulled out that manila folder she'd brought me earlier. "I've been keeping track of Deborah's violations for months," she said, handing the deputy a thick stack of papers. "These are HOA financial records that show unexplained expenditures. Look at this invoice for $4,200 for community beautification that Deborah authorized without board approval." My eyes widened as I realized what Joanne was showing us. Deborah had been embezzling HOA funds, and this whole dock controversy might be her way of deflecting attention from her financial crimes. The deputy studied the documents with growing interest. "Ma'am," he said to Deborah, "can you explain this expenditure? It's not authorized by the HOA board according to these meeting minutes." For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I saw genuine panic in Deborah's eyes. She started stammering about emergency landscaping and community improvements, but her story kept changing. That's completely unrelated to the current situation," she finally said. "Calvin Brooks is trying to distract from his violent behavior, but the deputy wasn't buying it anymore." Joanne's intervention was like a crack in Deborah's perfect narrative. Suddenly, other neighbors started coming forward with their own stories of HOA harassment and financial irregularities. Mrs. Patterson from down the street mentioned getting charged for community fees that nobody else had to pay. Tom Bradley talked about how Deborah had demanded he pay for landscaping that was supposed to come out of HOA funds. The deputy started asking more pointed questions about HOA finances and Deborah's authority, and I could see her confidence crumbling with each question. "Let me see the actual property documents," Deputy Morse said, finally cutting through all the drama and getting to the heart of the matter. I ran inside and grabbed my deed, my survey maps, and my original purchase contract, bringing them out in a neat folder like I should have done from the beginning. As the deputy examined the paperwork with his flashlight, I held my breath. This was the moment of truth. Either my documents would prove my case, or Deborah's lies would somehow win the day. After what felt like an eternity, Deputy Morse looked up from the papers and turned to Deborah. "Ma'am, according to these official documents, the dock is entirely on Mr. Brooks' private property. The HOA doesn't have any authority over private land use." I felt a surge of relief and vindication, but it was quickly replaced by anger as I realized how much stress and harassment I'd endured over something that was legally black and white. Deborah's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, then desperate calculation as she tried to figure out her next move. That night, after the deputy left and the neighborhood dispersed, I sat in my kitchen with Joanne, going through the financial documents she'd collected. The picture that emerged was damning. Deborah had been systematically misusing HOA funds for personal expenses and fake community projects. The dock controversy wasn't just about power and control, it was about covering up her embezzlement. I decided to keep this information secret for now, but I knew I had the ammunition I needed to end Deborah's reign of terror, once and for all. She'd picked the wrong person to mess with, and tomorrow she was going to find out just how wrong she'd been. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. Instead of just defending myself against Deborah's attacks, it was time to go on the offense. I spent the entire day organizing every piece of evidence I'd collected: photos, videos, recordings, documents, and now Joanne's bombshell financial records showing Deborah's embezzlement. Then I did something that probably should have occurred to me weeks earlier. I called a lawyer. Attorney Sarah Mitchell specialized in property disputes and HOA issues, and when I explained my situation and showed her the financial evidence, she was ready to help immediately. Sarah's first move was sending an official cease and desist letter to Deborah and the HOA board. The letter was beautiful in its legal precision, demanding that all harassment stop immediately and that the illegal fence be removed within 72 hours. But the real knockout punch was the second letter, a formal complaint to the HOA board about Deborah's unauthorized use of community funds, complete with copies of all the financial evidence Joanne had collected. Sarah sent both letters simultaneously, ensuring that the entire HOA board would see proof of Deborah's financial crimes. At the same time, they received demands to stop her harassment campaign. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Within hours, my phone was buzzing with messages from HOA board members who claimed they had no idea about the unauthorized expenditures. Board member Patricia Williams called me personally to apologize and promised an emergency audit of all HOA finances under Deborah's leadership. Tom Jenkins, another board member, sent me a long email explaining that Deborah had been making decisions without consulting the board for months. The house of cards was finally collapsing. But I wasn't content to just hide behind legal letters. I wanted the whole community to see who Deborah really was. That's when I launched my own documentation campaign. I created a simple website called The Truth About Pine Lake HOA and uploaded every video of Deborah lying, every photo of her trespassing, every piece of evidence showing her harassment, and now the financial documents proving her embezzlement. Then I made professional-looking posters with QR codes that linked to the website and put them up in all the legal public spaces around the neighborhood. The community response was immediate and dramatic. Neighbors who'd been avoiding me started stopping by to apologize and share their own Deborah horror stories. It turned out she'd been terrorizing people for years with fake fines, made-up violations, and threats of legal action. Mrs. Peterson showed me a letter demanding she remove her rose bushes because they were non-approved plantings. Tom Bradley had been forced to repaint his house twice because Deborah claimed the color was inconsistent with community standards. The woman had been running the HOA like her personal kingdom, extracting money and exerting control through fear and intimidation. What amazed me most was how far my story had spread beyond just our neighborhood. The website started getting visitors from other states, people dealing with their own HOA abuse who found hope in seeing someone fight back successfully. I received emails from homeowners in Texas, Florida, and California thanking me for standing up to HOA tyranny. One woman from Oregon wrote that she'd used my documentation techniques to expose corruption in her own community. I hadn't just solved my own problem, I had accidentally become a symbol for property rights and community justice. But Deborah wasn't going down without a fight. When she realized that public opinion was turning against her and the board was investigating her finances, she made one last desperate move. Instead of removing the fence like the lawyer's letter demanded, she doubled down. She organized what she called a community reclaim event and invited the whole neighborhood to have a barbecue on my dock. She set up tables and chairs right on my private property and sent out invitations claiming it was a celebration of community rights over individual selfishness. The leaked internal HOA emails that started circulating that afternoon showed just how desperate Deborah had become. Board members were demanding her resignation and threatening criminal charges over the missing funds. Deborah was sending increasingly frantic messages, claiming that the financial irregularities were accounting errors and that Calvin Brooks was orchestrating a conspiracy against her. The emails painted a picture of someone completely detached from reality, doubling down on lies even as the evidence mounted against her. I couldn't believe the audacity. After weeks of harassment, after being proven wrong by the police, after receiving an official legal demand to stop, she was now openly encouraging the entire neighborhood to trespass on my property. It was like she'd completely lost touch with reality, but in a way, her desperation was exactly what I needed. By organizing an illegal gathering on private property, she was giving me the clearest case of trespassing and harassment I could ask for. And this time, with all the evidence I'd gathered and the legal support I now had, there would be no ambiguity about who was in the wrong. Joanne Clark had become my unofficial neighborhood ally, and when she saw what Deborah was planning, she started her own counter-campaign. She began live streaming from her yard, explaining to anyone who would listen that this was private property and that Deborah was asking people to break the law. Other neighbors started joining in, sharing the website I'd created and talking openly about Deborah's years of harassment and financial abuse. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt like the community was finally seeing the truth. The sound of approaching sirens told me that Deputy Morse was on his way, and this time, there would be no escaping the consequences of Deborah's actions. Deputy Morse arrived just as Deborah was setting up the first picnic table on my dock. The sight was surreal. My private property had been turned into some kind of bizarre neighborhood protest, with about 15 people milling around carrying plates and lawn chairs like they were at a legitimate community event. Deborah had positioned herself at the center of it all, still filming everything and narrating like she was some kind of civil rights hero, making a stand for justice. "Folks, I need everyone to step back from the dock area," Deputy Morse announced as he approached. His voice had the kind of authority that made people stop what they were doing and pay attention. "I've reviewed the property documents, and this is privately owned land. You're all trespassing right now." The effect was immediate. Most of the neighbors started backing away, looking confused and embarrassed. But Deborah held her ground, clutching her phone and continuing to live stream. "Officer, this is community property," Deborah insisted, her voice getting shrill with desperation. "The HOA has easement rights and community access agreements that supersede individual property claims." Even as she said it, I could tell she knew she was lying. But she'd invested so much time and energy into this fight that backing down would mean admitting she'd been wrong about everything. Deputy Morse pulled out his copy of my property deed and held it up for everyone to see. "Ma'am, there are no easement rights listed in these documents," the deputy said patiently. "This dock is 100% on Mr. Brooks' private property. The HOA has no legal authority here whatsoever." Then he said the words I'd been waiting to hear for weeks. "This is private property, and you need to leave immediately." The statement was simple and clear, and it cut through all of Deborah's lies and manipulation like a knife through butter. I felt a surge of vindication watching the neighbors' faces as the truth finally sank in. They'd been manipulated and lied to for weeks, and now they were seeing the reality of the situation. That's when Deborah completely lost it. Instead of accepting reality and walking away, she started arguing with the police officer. "You don't understand the situation here," she shouted, waving her phone around wildly. "This man has been terrorizing our community for months. He's selfish and aggressive and dangerous." When Deputy Morse calmly repeated his instruction for her to leave the property, she actually pushed him, not hard, but enough to cross a line that no reasonable person crosses. "Ma'am, you're now interfering with a police investigation," Deputy Morse said, his patience finally wearing thin. "I'm going to need you to calm down and step away from the dock immediately, or you'll be facing additional charges." But Deborah was beyond rational thought at this point. She kept screaming about community rights and individual selfishness, making less and less sense with each sentence. It was like watching someone have a complete mental breakdown in real time. As the crowd grew larger with curious neighbors drawn by the commotion, old John Patterson from the end of the street stepped forward. He was in his 70s, a retired engineer who'd lived in Pine Lake longer than anyone else. "Often," he said in a steady voice, I think you should know that this woman forced me to tear down my fence last year because she said it blocked the community's view of the lake. Cost me $800 to rebuild it exactly where it was before, just to get her to stop harassing me. Other neighbors started speaking up with their own stories. Forced home repairs, arbitrary fines, threats, and intimidation that had been going on for years. That's when I decided it was time to reveal everything I'd been documenting. I pulled out my phone and started playing the videos of Deborah lying to the HOA board, trespassing on my property, and creating fake surveys. "Deputy, I've got hours of footage showing her harassment campaign," I said, handing him my phone. "She's been lying to the community for weeks, filing false complaints, and manipulating people with fake evidence." But the real bombshell came when Joanne Clark stepped forward with the financial documents. "She's also been stealing money from the HOA," Joanne announced, "thousands of dollars in unauthorized spending that the board never approved." The neighborhood crowd had grown as people heard the commotion, and they were all watching as the truth finally came out. It was like a dam had burst, and years of suppressed frustration came pouring out. People were talking about fake fines, made-up violations, and threats that had made their lives miserable. The community was finally seeing Deborah for what she really was, not a community leader protecting everyone's interests, but a bully and a thief who'd been exploiting her position for personal gain. Within an hour, everything changed. The other HOA board members, who had been conducting an emergency meeting in the community center, came out to publicly announce Deborah's removal from office. Patricia Williams, speaking for the board, read a statement saying they'd discovered significant financial irregularities and unauthorized expenditures under Deborah's leadership, and that criminal charges were being considered. Joanne Clark was unanimously elected as interim president, and her first official act was to rescind all of Deborah's fake fines and violations. The illegal fence was removed that same afternoon, with the whole neighborhood watching. But the most satisfying moment came when Deborah finally realized that her reign of terror was over. As the neighbors dispersed and the fence crew packed up their tools, she stood alone in my yard, looking lost and defeated. All her bluster and manipulation had crumbled when faced with actual legal authority and community opposition. "This isn't over, Calvin," she said quietly as she walked away. But we both knew it was. Her credibility was destroyed, her position was gone, and the community had seen through her lies. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, but several neighbors approached me to apologize and thank me for standing up to someone they'd all been afraid to confront. Later that evening, the HOA board held an emergency meeting in the community center that was open to all residents. The atmosphere was completely different from the hostile meetings Deborah had orchestrated. Board members publicly apologized for allowing the harassment to continue and announced a complete review of all HOA policies and financial records. They established new transparency requirements and term limits to prevent any future abuse of power. John Patterson made a motion to officially recognize the Calvin Brooks defense of property rights as a model for how the community should handle disputes in the future. 3 weeks later, Deborah Monroe moved out of Pine Lake. Nobody was sorry to see her go. My dock is more peaceful than it's ever been, and I can finally enjoy my property without looking over my shoulder for harassment. The website I created documenting her behavior has been shared over 100,000 times and has become a resource for other communities dealing with HOA abuse. Joanne is doing a fantastic job as the new HOA president, and her first major policy was called the Respect Private Property Act, a no more HOA interference with individual property rights. As I sat on my dock that final evening, watching the sun set over the lake that had caused so much trouble, I poured myself a glass of water and reflected on everything that had happened. I didn't feel victorious or triumphant, just tired and relieved. I didn't win, I said to myself, thinking about all the stress and conflict of the past months. I just didn't lose, and sometimes that's enough. The lake was calm, my property was secure, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly at peace in my own home. Sometimes justice really does win, and communities really can change when people stand up to bullies. The dock that started this whole mess is still right where it's always been, on my private property, exactly where it belongs. Comment justice below if this story made you feel as satisfied as it made me feel to live through it. Because sometimes, when you stand up for what's right, even the biggest bullies have to back down.